The phrase I get all the time is I'm always trying to shove my agenda down their throat, which seems sexually charged to me. I don't know.
What if I told you that this man right here created some of the most iconic, legendary black comic book stories ever written, and his influence to this day still affects how fictional black characters are written across all media? A little over a year ago, I released a video in which I detailed the problems and issues that often come with non-black writers attempting to write black characters. How far too often these writers lack the lived experiences or don't do enough research to capture the myriad of different forms of blackness that exist, which in turn ends up with some really shitty and sometimes offensive results. Without that lived experience, you'll never capture many of the small yet equally important nuances that come with being black. You end up creating either a caricature of black people or a two-dimensional character whose only personality is that they're black. And this is what separates a specifically black story from a story where the main character just so happens to be black. The former involves the character's blackness being integral to the story itself. While this applies to all forms of entertainment media, in comic books this nuance has historically been lacking. Prior to the modern age, there weren't many stories that explored their black characters beyond the surface level. While there were many non-black writers and artists that have made great contributions, these same writers weren't immune to the aforementioned issue. The industry was accustomed to treating many black characters as afterthoughts, sidekicks, stereotypes, or symbols of progress, but rarely full people. Many of these were noble, well-intended attempts at being more inclusive, but were severely lacking with any sort of care or nuance to flesh them out. Many publishers simply didn't know how to utilize the characters, with DC arguably being the worst offender when compared to others. Aside from a select few, it would be years before many of these black characters were fleshed out.
If you write a black character, he represents blackness, and that's ridiculous. That's way too much, way too complex, way too much weight for any character, any single character to hold. Whereas if you write a white character, he's that guy.
Enter Dwayne McDuffie. In 1987, what began as a humble assistant editor working at Marvel Comics would soon grow into a man spending the next half a decade changing the trajectory of comic books. Not only would he craft stories that broke the mold in how black and minority characters were represented, but would take it a step even further with his creation of Milestone Media, a black-owned comic book company dedicated to crafting characters who weren't just visually black, but authentically reflected black identity, purpose, and lived experience. And this is one of the many reasons why it's necessary to give Dwayne his flowers. He understood that representation wasn't just about putting a black face in the panel. It was about authorship, voice, and control over the narrative. Without that, even the most well-meaning attempts at inclusion fall flat because they aren't rooted in real experience. Truth is, the industry never had a problem with blackness per se, as long as it was manageable, marketable, and made by them. We don't have a problem with black characters, just as long as they're not too political, you know? Not too black. Yeah, too black. And not much about this argument has really changed over the years. Anytime a story related to the medium dares to center blackness unapologetically, it gets labeled as pandering or pushing an agenda. It's what happens when you have a mostly white male audience that's been conditioned over the decades to see themselves as the default. Anything outside of this narrow frame, stories about race, queerness, gender, or even just other kinds of people that don't fit this mold, is treated like an attack, a forced political statement that's shoved down their throats.
Shove my agenda down their throat.
It's not enough for a character to just exist authentically. Their presence must be justified, softened, or explained. It's the exact kind of idiotic logic that Dwayne spent majority of his career fighting against, and a fight that we have to continue, as these types of clowns didn't just go away. They've got a bigger platform than ever before.
Only a couple good people in this movie. You had Bruce Wayne, Batman, and you had Alfred. Those are the only two good white people.
Let's swap out beloved legacy characters for diverse new alternatives.
McDuffie's going to turn the Justice League all black. He's getting rid of the white guys.
You had Jim Gordon, who's black in this. You had Catwoman, who's not white in this. And then you had the Mayor, who's a black woman. Again, very much on the nose for current day Hollywood.
I guess you just can't make some folks happy. There's always going to be people who will go through the most insane mental gymnastics to explain why they think the latest piece of media is ruined by diversity and quote-unquote woke agendas. When examining Dwayne McDuffie's legacy in entertainment, we often focus on his accomplishments, not realizing that his work was never finished. It was a foundation, not a finale. He was an architect that set the blueprint for how we write black characters on screen and on the page, showcasing the myriad of different ways that black stories can be written while still being bold, unapologetic, and uncompromising. So, let's explore what happens when you refuse to play by the rules. What happens when you're too black for comics?
This won't be like the last time you took something that belonged to me.
Anything I took was freely offered. Maybe you should take better care of your stuff.
As usual, before we get started, let's establish some things. This is not going to be a biography of Dwayne McDuffie, nor a full history of Milestone Comics. While we'll touch on both, this video is more about applying both their approach and philosophies regarding the medium to our much wider entertainment landscape today. I feel like it's much more useful to treat their work not as relics of the past, but as blueprints. Like we said, a foundation for how we tell our stories, who gets to tell them, and what those stories are even allowed to say. Because at its core, their philosophy wasn't just about representation, it was about agency. It's about shifting the power to define blackness, identity, and humanity away from the boardrooms and back into the hands of the people living and reading it. If you're looking for a more comprehensive biography, then in addition to this video, I suggest checking out The Color of Comics from Robert Kirkland's Secret History of Comics series. It's about an hour long and features interviews from those behind Milestone Medium themselves. I'll be linking it in the description below. In addition, this video is not claiming that it's impossible for non-black writers to contribute to these kinds of stories. Knowing that some of you goofies love to misrepresent things, even with them being explicitly spelled out for you, I can already hear some of y'all in the comments. Pillboy said I can't write black characters if I'm not black. That's right, beat it, Whitey. Scram! That's not what's being argued. Instead, what's being argued is that writing black characters authentically requires more than just adding melanin and AAVE. It demands empathy, a shit ton of research, and a willingness to center experiences that aren't your own, without turning them into a caricature or trauma porn. The issue isn't who is allowed to write these stories, but who gets the agency to define them. Are black characters being crafted with intention, or are they just aesthetic choices to imply diversity? Because while anyone can write black stories, black creators should be the ones leading them. Not for exclusion's sake, but because representation without agency isn't progress, it's performance. To illustrate this, we're going to begin by exploring the Milestone Method. Not just how Milestone Comics was able to build such a cohesive universe, but also reach their audience in such a way. What the hell were they even on to cook up something this hard? Can you even do something like this today? Well, yes. You just need the right cookbook.
Oh! Oh! Oh my God, you got me. That's what I was trying to tell you. Only my costume is bulletproof.
What made Dwayne and Milestone Media so impactful was their ability to craft a myriad of different black stories while still being bold, unapologetic, and uncompromising in the process. And when you follow their philosophy, you can see a clear roadmap in how they were able to do so, and that's by writing with a purposeful lens, expanding the spectrum of black identity, and shifting power behind the scenes. Together, these three pillars don't just define Milestone's legacy, but they lay the foundation for how black stories can and should be told across all media. It all starts with the first pillar, writing with a purposeful lens, where every story has meaning beyond the page. This requires the storyteller to move beyond surface level or performative representation, and instead engage deeply with the realities, histories, and nuances of the culture they're trying to depict. This approach isn't just about having black characters in a story, but instead about centering their experiences as complex human beings shaped by unique social, political, and cultural forces. Without this lens, you risk black characters falling into stereotypical molds. The angry thug, the magical Negro, the sassy sidekick, the hypermasculine caricature stripped of any sort of vulnerability. Lazy tropes that reduce black people to one-dimensional cliches. In comics, this problem reached its peak around the 70s. You'd get black characters, but often only in certain roles or without fully fleshed out identities. You'd see Falcon, but only really when he's sharing a series with Captain America. And it wouldn't be until '83 that he'd get his own 4-issue limited solo series. Luke Cage and Black Lightning both started off as the streetwise vigilante trope that came out of the blaxploitation era, with most of their dialogue being imitation AAVE in an attempt to make them sound more quote-unquote authentic. Hell, for the longest time, Luke Cage's entire personality was just, "Where's my money?" The weird part is, many of these non-black writers weren't trying to be offensive, they genuinely wanted to represent black audiences. Luke Cage and Black Lightning were intended to tackle more grounded street issues, whereas with Black Panther, writers Don McGregor and Jack Kirby managed to craft a character complete with an Afro-futuristic mythos. Despite this, there was still something missing. For all the racial and social themes these characters touched on, there was still a disconnect created by the lack of lived-in authenticity. Voices that felt like they came from within the community rather from outside looking in. And that's where Dwayne McDuffie and the Milestone crew came in, by writing with a lens that wasn't just about representation, but about intention. Instead of the writer starting from, how can I fit a black character into this superhero formula, it becomes, what would this world, story, and character look like if we built it from the ground up with their lived reality at the center. For the folks at Milestone, this is something they wanted to do from the very start. When the crew first began drafting the first stories, the main focus was on authenticity-driven storytelling. In a March 2010 interview, Dwayne expands on this. "I'm conscious of race whenever I'm writing, just as I'm conscious of class, religion, human psychology, politics, everything that makes up the human experience. I don't think I can do a good job if I'm not paying attention to what's meaningful to people. And in American culture, there isn't anything that informs human interaction more than the idea of race." When you write black stories this way, the character becomes a living, breathing product of the world they live in. By anchoring characters in these authentic contexts, their identities aren't isolated traits, but inseparable from their narrative arcs. This depth gives writers the tools to create nuanced conflicts and growth that resonate beyond cliches, and we can see this in their characters. Let's take Icon for example. They could have easily made him Black Superman, despite both sharing similar abilities and origins. Instead, they deliberately shaped him in ways that made his blackness and lived history inseparable from his superhero identity. Instead of landing on a farm in Kansas, he lands on a southern plantation in the 1800s. Instead of being raised by the Kents, he's raised by enslaved black Americans. He ages far slower than a human, and as a result, has witnessed slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, civil rights, and beyond. His definition of quote-unquote truth, justice, and the American way is shaped by seeing America's promise broken repeatedly for black people. That history makes him cautious, favoring assimilation, self-reliance, and incremental change over radical upheaval. Not out of naivety, but because centuries of survival taught him that bold revolutions are often met with brutal backlash. This in turn makes him favor conservatism, often putting him at odds with younger, more radical heroes such as Rocket. It's what transforms him from a Superman copy into a character whose every decision is a commentary on survival, justice, and the complicated paths towards real change. But we can also see this with Hardware. On the surface level, he seems like your typical genius inventor archetype, you know? Uses his intellect to create weapons and technology to aid him on his crusade. Again, the writers didn't want to just create Black Tony Stark or a Mr. Terrific clone, but rather a character whose intelligence, inventions, and worldview were shaped by his lived experiences in a racially unequal America. Instead of starting with genius billionaire builds armor, they started with what happens when a black genius is systemically denied the power his talents should earn him. Curtis Metcalf becomes Hardware because his brilliance is exploited by a corporate system that will never see him as an equal. The same system that uses his inventions to terrorize his own community. His nemesis, Edwin Alva, isn't just your typical corporate villain. He's a living representation of corporate racism and the exploitation of black labor. It goes from beating the big bad villain to instead dismantling the power structure that gave him power to begin with. Together, both Icon and Hardware show exactly why Milestone was so impactful. These characters weren't just palette swaps of existing superheroes, they were stories built from the ground up to reflect the different facets of the Black experience. Icon embodied the long view of history, centuries of living in survival mode shaping his cautious, conservative approach, while Hardware captured the rage and frustration of a brilliant mind shackled by systemic racism. Neither story diluted its message to fit mainstream comfort. Both leaned into their specificity and in doing so spoke to their audiences. Speaking of the different facets of the Black experience, we now lead to the second pillar, expanding the spectrum of Black identity, where no single character carries the burden of representation and the richness of different Black experiences can exist in all their complexity. This requires the writer to break away from a single universal depiction of Blackness and instead showcase the multiplicity of Black lives. While avoiding the first pillar risks creating a shallow, performative representation, avoiding pillar 2 risks reducing Blackness down to a monolith. A character can be as thoroughly fleshed out and layered as you want, but if their identity is framed through the same narrow archetype over and over again, it only reinforces the harmful idea that there's only one way to quote-unquote be Black. It's how you wind up with the same recurring roles across media, the no-nonsense stoic, the silent muscle, the stone-faced leader. Playing into a specific archetype isn't inherently negative, but when it's the same archetypes over and over, it flattens the spectrum of different Black experiences. You can take two Black characters that live vastly different lives. One is a suburban kid obsessed with Yu-Gi-Oh! And listens to KMFDM and 9 Inch Nails. The other lives in a working class neighborhood in the city and collects soul records and does community work with their spare time. Both are authentic expressions of Black identity. The danger comes when writers don't allow for that plurality, flattening identity into one quote-unquote acceptable version. By the time the early 90s came around, mainstream comics had begun making small strides in showing more variation, but it was still a slow drip. Writers would expand Storm, Luke Cage, T'Challa, and Jon Stewart's individual personalities, but not beyond the no-nonsense, always serious archetype. The result was progress, but progress bound by a very narrow mold. Milestone then comes in and directly challenges that. If the first pillar is about depth, making sure a Black character feels like a human being rather than a surface level costume, then the second pillar is about breadth, ensuring there's no single template for being Black. They understood that representation couldn't just be one voice carrying the weight, it had to be a chorus. They knew the key wasn't just adding one more serious, noble Black hero, but instead building a world where multiple, contradictory, even messy expressions of Black identity could coexist. And this couldn't have happened solely with Dwayne McDuffie behind the scenes. Milestone was never a one-man show. Dwayne co-founded it with Dennis Cowan, Derek Dingle, and Michael Davis, all who were veterans of the industry by the time they started up the company. Even in its infancy stages, they had helps from the likes of Christopher Priest, who was already trailblazing through the game and would later go on to do the best Black Panther run of all time. I don't care what anybody says, you can quote me on that. Despite most of them being colleagues for years, and in the case of Dennis and Derek, even childhood friends, none of them lived an identical life to one another. They all had different lived experiences as Black men, and were able to funnel those distinctions into the foundation of Milestone. Dwayne's sharp wit and structural precision, Dennis's striking visual language, Derek's business and journalism acumen, Michael's gift for character and narrative. All of these lenses collided, overlapped, and expanded through the worlds they built. Dwayne explains, if you do a Black character or a female character or an Asian character, then they aren't just that character. They have to represent that race or that sex, and they can't be interesting because everything they do has to represent an entire block of people. We knew we had to present a range of characters within each ethnic group, which means we couldn't just do one book. We had to present a view of the world that's wider than the world we've seen before. Let's start with arguably Milestone's most popular character, Static. Before we proceed, I'm only gonna say this once. His name is Static. His name is not Static Shock. That's the name of his TV show, alright? That's like me watching 12 Years a Slave and then calling Solomon Northup 12 Years the Slave. Anyways, Static was more than just Milestone's breakout hero. He was their answer to Spider-Man, not in a, oh, let's make our own version of Peter Parker sense, but in how he embodied the everyday, awkward, coming-of-age struggles of a teenager navigating powers, bullies, friendships, and responsibility. Virgil Hawkins is a nerd. He's smart, he's charismatic, he's witty, he's a joker, he's a kid with crushes and insecurities. In many ways, he's what many readers and audience members of his show saw in themselves. You take a character like him and juxtapose him with someone like Icon or Hardware, it's a night and day difference. Even when juxtaposed with characters like Rocket, who, despite being similar ages, has a completely different set of circumstances, personality, and outlook on the world. Different upbringings, morals, ideologies, political opinions, humor, sexuality, class. No two characters are the same. Dennis Cowan elaborates, if you only have one black hero, then everything about him is supposed to stand for the whole race. That's a trap. We wanted a world where we could have more than one, where we could be alien, another could be a teenage nerd, another a single mother, another an inventor. That's the only way you get honesty, by showing the variety of black life, not just one example. When you break these singular archetypes, you're able to create stories where black characters don't feel like stand-ins for an entire people, but like fully realized individuals. That's what makes the difference between a token and a character you can actually connect with. By building a roster where no two characters were the same, Milestone Comics gave black audiences something rare at the time: options. They weren't handed a single character and told, this is what blackness looks like. Instead, they were presented with a spectrum of experiences, personalities, and worldviews that acknowledged blackness as multifaceted, not monolithic. That's what made the stories resonate. They weren't written to check a box, they were written to reflect life. That being said, we now move on to the final pillar: shifting power behind the scenes, where the creators of the stories are given agency. This isn't just about who's writing the dialogue or sketching the panels, it's about who actually holds the keys to the storytelling machine, who decides what gets greenlit, how it's marketed, how it's distributed, and what kind of risks are worth taking. That power usually sits with the publisher, the executives, the people that control the money and visibility. Milestone was a rare case in comics history because while their books were published through DC Comics, they weren't under DC's editorial thumb. They had a really unique deal. DC essentially licensed Milestone's characters and creative output for an annual fee and a cut of the profits. But Milestone Media itself retained copyright over its properties. They had complete control over story and editorial decisions, and even had the final say in merchandising and licensing. This is how you get Static crossing over into the DCAU while still being a Milestone original character. The only real power DC had was the right to refuse to publish something they objected to. In practice, this meant Milestone's creators had a level of autonomy that was essentially unheard of at the time. They weren't pitching an idea to DC in hopes that some editor got it or understood it. They were setting their own tone, their own rules, and their own boundaries. That's what made Milestone so special. They put black creators in a position to protect their work from being diluted or reshaped by executives who didn't understand their vision. The stories could be sharper, riskier, and more authentic precisely because Milestone controlled the pen and paper. This is what agency looks like in action. It's not just about being allowed to tell stories about black heroes, but building a framework where these stories couldn't be taken away, rewritten, or stripped of their meaning. However, as great as this deal was, it still came with issues. DC still had the ability to refuse to publish content it found objectionable. In practice, that meant DC did interfere, but only when they needed to. Wait, needed to? The hell does that mean? Well, let's ask Dwayne. As Dwayne McDuffie later recalled, there were storylines that made them, quote-unquote, very uncomfortable.
The biggest actual fight that we had was an issue of Static, who was a teenage superhero. And on the cover, he's making out with his girlfriend. There's no flesh exposed, but they're going at it pretty good. And it came back that DC didn't want to publish this cover. They told me because DC Comics doesn't use sex to sell their comic books. And you know, as I'm talking to the guy, there's a big rack behind him of all the DC books that were out that month. And literally over his shoulder is a picture, it's a Legion of Superheroes cover with the very attractive female team member, her ass pointing at the camera. She's looking over her shoulder, sort of come hither and saying, "We're back," you know. And I'm, I'm like, yeah, well, you know, compared to kissing, it kind of depends, you know. So we kind of went back and forth over it, and I said, "Oh, did the condoms make you nervous? Because, you know, some people think raincoats cause rain, so we could take the condoms out," and that wasn't it. And finally, the compromise we came up with was we put the cover on the inside, and we wrapped a black heart. It was like a black border that was a heart, and just the two faces kissing, so you couldn't see that they were, you know, on a couch going at it like 15-year-olds all over America, you know. That was a huge, huge fight, and I think a lot of it wasn't about sexuality, it was about black sexuality, which makes people really uncomfortable.
And it's hard to ignore the double standard. White heroes could be hypersexualized, scantily clad on covers, and even have storylines full of implied intimacy, and it was just a part of the genre. But when Static shows a few barely visible condoms out of focus on the cover, it wasn't received as a PSA or a real-life teaching moment. It was treated as dangerous, inappropriate, something that could threaten the brand. For as much artistic liberty that DC had given Milestone, there was still an invisible ceiling. How far stories could go before they tripped over corporate discomfort. They weren't trying to be edgy or doing it for shock value, they were addressing real issues for real teenagers. Exactly the kind of audience that Static was written for. But DC's reaction revealed just how much of a double-edged sword it is when it comes to giving black creators agency. You can tell your stories just so long as it doesn't make our wider audience uncomfortable. And this is exactly why breaking that discomfort is necessary. Because if you can't tell the truth about race, class, sex, or identity without corporate hands pulling you back, then the stories will never evolve past the same safe templates we've been fed for decades. That discomfort is where the growth happens. Fiction stops being pure escapism and starts reflecting the world as it actually is. Milestone understood that you can't claim to represent people while erasing the very realities that shape their lives. And by pushing those boundaries, they weren't just fighting for themselves. They cracked the door open for every creator who'd been told that their stories were too much, too political, too risky. Latino heroes, Asian heroes, queer heroes, female heroes, disabled heroes, all of them stood to gain from the precedent Milestone set by insisting on their right to tackle issues head on and tell their stories in a raw, unfiltered way. That's what made Dwayne McDuffie and Milestone Media so impactful. They weren't just creating black superheroes. I mean, plenty of companies had done that before. It was that they built a system of agency where those heroes could exist without compromise. That's why they connected so deeply with audiences. Readers could feel the authenticity on the page because the stories weren't filtered through an editor's discomfort or a publisher's fear of controversy. They were sharp, unflinching, and real, which made the victories, struggles, and personalities of those characters resonate far beyond the panels. That's the Milestone Method. Writing with a purposeful lens, expanding the spectrum of black identity, and shifting power behind the scenes. Doing so not just improves black stories, but helps your audience connect to them even more. But nothing good ever lasts forever. Milestone Media came out during a really rough time in comics. The early 90s boom created a massive bubble fueled by speculation, gimmicks, and variant covers. And like all bubbles, it's eventually gonna burst. By 96, the comic industry had essentially crashed, and around half of comic book stores in the US alone closed permanently. Milestone and other independent companies were hit the hardest. By 95, they had canceled all of their lowest selling titles, and by 97, had shut down their comics division altogether. They would remain in a weird, comatose state before finally going defunct in 2008. But for Dwayne McDuffie, his story didn't end there. He soon quickly pivoted into animation and screenwriting, where he continued to push the envelope. He wrote for the DCAU with shows like Justice League Unlimited, as well as his baby Static Shock. In addition, he was one of the main writers for Dead. In addition, he was one of the main writers for Ben 10, not only giving all three shows arguably some of their best seasons ever written, but channeling his views into audiences far bigger than the comic shop crowd ever could reach. Dwayne had proven that the screen could amplify voices the comic shelves couldn't contain, but this success didn't silence his critics. The same forces that once tried to box in Milestone's stories, the discomfort with black agency, the pushback against inclusive storytelling. Those culture war reactionaries didn't just stay in the comic. They jumped ship from the page to the screen.
What would her Jarvis be called? Jamiqua?
Jarvisqua. I already said Jarvisqua.
Jaquisha? I think Jamichael works good.
I'm going with Shanae.
But there were only a couple good people in this movie. You had Bruce Wayne, Batman, and you had Alfred. Those are the only two good white people. The rest of the three other major players that I would consider like overall like moral good people were, you had Jim Gordon, who's black in this. You had Catwoman, who's not white in this, and then you had the mayor, who's a black woman. Again, very much on the nose for current day Hollywood. Did not.
Oh boy, I'm so glad we figured out there's a way to write black characters that not only fleshes them out, but avoids cliches and stereotypes. I guess everyone's happy now, right? Oh my god. In our previous chapter, we saw how Milestone broke the industry mold when it came to black characters, with Dwayne McDuffie in particular taking this approach with him to the screen. However, the types of battles he faced weren't limited to just comics. The same forces that resisted Milestone's vision, the reactionary outrage, bias, and discomfort with multicultural stories, permeated into the screen and beyond. This chapter examines how these opponents evolved, how they try to justify their arguments against progressive politics and storytelling, and why their resistance proves exactly why Dwayne's work was necessary. Regardless of whatever your favorite anti-woke flavor is, be it movies, television, animation, comics, gaming, all have the same underlying argument, that progressive agendas are being shoehorned into entertainment, and in the process, the quality of storytelling is being sacrificed. An argument that's often contradicted by the very same media they love to praise. First things first is how they evolved. What's important to understand is that this isn't a new debate. The criticism that forced progressive politics ruins storytelling has been recycled talking points for decades, only wearing new labels with each generation. When Dwayne McDuffie was pushing Milestone's vision, the same arguments surfaced, that these stories were somehow too political and being forced onto mainstream audiences, that he was pandering to black comic readers. This may be more popular with film and television nowadays, but the script remains the same, an old enemy now playing on a new stage. We can historically see this with arguably Dwayne McDuffie's greatest work, Season 2 of Justice League Unlimited. At this point, Dwayne had already co-written 2 seasons of the show, giving it some of its best work. And while progressive politics had always been woven into the storylines of episodes, Season 2 went full steam ahead. The main story arc of this season is the conflict between the League and Cadmus, a government agency created as a response to the team's growing proliferation, unchecked power, and fear of them becoming authoritarians. The writers used this setup to not only create an amazing political thriller, but simultaneously a direct critique of the then Bush administration of the time. Cadmus is obsessed with the danger of unchecked power, but in doing so, it mirrors the paranoia of post 9/11 America. Just as the Bush administration justified surveillance programs and preemptive wars by insisting liberty had to be sacrificed for quote-unquote safety, the League's freedom to act without government oversight is constantly under fire. Superman is even framed as a potential tyrant, not because he's evil, but because the sheer scale of his unchecked power scares people. Again, mirroring the debates of the early 2000s, when the US cast itself as a global enforcer in the war on terror, acting unilaterally and crossing borders without real accountability. Cadmus creates weapons specifically to neutralize the League, from Galatea to the Ultimate, mirroring how the Bush administration expanded military spending, preemptive war strategies, and domestic surveillance programs in the name of quote-unquote protection. The show even explicitly asks, who's watching the Watchers?
Quis custodia tipsos custodies.
Who guards the Guardians? We got it covered.
government oversight, surveillance, abuse of power. Top that off with the real villain of the season being a billionaire who exploits both sides of the conflict for his own gain. The end result is a beautiful political roller coaster disguised as a superhero story, and audiences loved it. Not only is it considered the greatest storyline of the DCAU, but one of the greatest superhero storylines ever told on screen. It's a masterclass in how you can use progressive politics to heighten tension, deepen character stakes, and tell a story that resonates far beyond capes and costumes, proving that good storytelling and political awareness aren't opposites, but partners, especially when it comes to superheroes. But in spite of all the critical acclaim, there was still that loud, isolated minority. A small, reactionary group that complained that the show had gone too political. To them, Justice League was supposed to be pure escapism, not a reflection of government overreach or foreign policy debates. Some complained that it felt like left-wing political propaganda that would only resonate with certain ideological groups. Others felt it was pandering and inauthentic. They felt that the writers were so busy trying to fulfill some sort of political agenda that they took away from the core essence of what the show was about. It didn't matter how well executed or well written it was, some just couldn't shake the progressive narrative. They remained in their own corner of the fandom, clinging to the belief that politics had ruined the show, even as the wider community celebrated it as a masterpiece. And while these corners were far more isolated and less vitriolic than they are nowadays, the underlying argument remains the same, that superhero media should be pure escapism, so long as the escapism never forces them to confront ideas that challenge their worldview. It doesn't matter how well or gracefully done it may be. The second a narrative unsettles the status quo they identify with, it stops being storytelling and starts being propaganda. There's this scene from the episode Clash that these folks love to cherry pick and post out of context, and it's the scene from the beginning where Superman and the original members are chastising Captain Marvel for getting involved in politics.
Holy moly. When you joined this team, you became something more than just a hero. I know that, sir, but you became a symbol that represents all of us. Yes, sir. We don't play favorites, we don't sell deodorant on television, and we don't get involved in politics. Yes, sir. And we certainly don't endorse supervillains for the presidency.
See? Even the League members say to avoid politics. But here's the catch. If you watch the rest of the episode, it becomes painfully obvious that the League isn't delving into a grand statement about staying apolitical. It's about how being apolitical or naively political gets you used by assholes like Lex Luthor. The League, particularly Superman, is growing increasingly paranoid about Luthor, who at this point is running for president. He then uses that to engineer events and publicity that both make himself look heroic and provoke a reaction that will benefit his campaign, including baiting a public conflict that draws Superman and Captain Marvel into a fight. The showdown is visually brutal and narratively framed as a result of manipulation, not a pure ideological clash. The whole story is about trust, naivety, and how easily public perception can be weaponized. Superman misjudges the situation, and Captain Marvel calls him out on it.
Captain, I want no more lectures. I called this meeting and I'm gonna have my say. But my whole life I've looked up to the League. You were my heroes, every one of you. And you were more than a hero. I idolized you, I wanted to be you. Whenever I was out there facing down the bad guys, I'd think, what would Superman do? Now I know. I believe in fair play. I believe in taking people at their word and giving them the benefit of the doubt. Back home, I've come up against my share of pretty nasty bad guys, but I never had to act the way they did to win a fight. I always found another way. I guess I'm saying I like being a hero, a symbol. And that's why I'm quitting the Justice League. You don't act like heroes anymore.
He's right. They set you up, Clark.
Does it really make a difference?
By the end of the episode, the League comes off as being wrong, because that's the point. The show was exploring how messy it gets when superpowered beings start intersecting with real institutions of power. It wasn't some clean, don't get political lesson. If anything, it was saying the second superheroes pretend they're above politics, that's when they're the most vulnerable to being used by it. But you take that argument and apply it 20, even 10 years later, what's evolved? The language has definitely changed, the cultural flashpoints are different, but the biggest difference between then and now is the internet, and how massively it amplified these arguments. What was once confined to a few niche forums and blog sites now dominates entire timelines, YouTube feeds, and algorithm-driven outrage cycles. And with the popularity of comic book media exploding thanks to the MCU, those arguments have only grown louder, and that's why the argument feels so inescapable or larger than it is in real life. It's not that the complaints are any different, they're the same recycled talking points about agendas and politics ruining escapism. It's that the internet has made them louder, faster, and harder to ignore. What used to be grumbling on the margins of fandom is now packed into YouTube essays, Twitter threads, and headlines, giving the illusion of a massive cultural shift when in reality, it's the same small crowd with a bigger microphone. Do they still use the Brie Larson thumbnails in 2025? I'm not sure. I thought that was like a 2019, 2018, 2020 thing. They then have to try to justify these arguments. Regardless of how flashy their thumbnails are, they still have to convince you. They gotta back up these claims. Well, spoiler alert, they can't. So instead, they rely on amplifying outrage and positioning themselves as defenders of real storytelling. The problem is, the math don't add up. The claim that progressive politics ruins storytelling has never actually been backed up by the stories themselves, nor how audiences respond. In fact, some of the most successful stories in terms of box office, sales, and reception were built on the very politics these crowds claimed would destroy them. And nobody showed this better than Dwayne McDuffie himself. We're gonna step away from the screen and back into his home turf of comics. Dwayne was no stranger to reactionary fans drumming up outrage whenever a story didn't match their ideas of what superheroes should be. They used the same pseudo-justification. Take one panel, one scene, one character choice, or one storyline out of context and spin it into an existential threat against the media. Let's take his Fantastic Four run, for example. McDuffie put Storm and T'Challa on Marvel's First Family during Reed and Sue's hiatus. Critics accused him of shoehorning black characters into a traditionally white lineup, a lineup that had been no stranger to substitutes when need be. Outrage posts and fan letters framed it as Marvel caving into quote-unquote diversity quotas. But here's the thing, sales were steady. Critics praised McDuffie's handling of Reed and Sue's absence, and in retrospect, it's one of the most seamless roster shifts in Fantastic Four history. The audience didn't feel a sacrifice in the quality, they continued to buy the book. But then you have to remember, the outrage wasn't about story quality, it was about discomfort with change. Or let's take a look at his Justice League of America run. Now, this run is pretty controversial for a couple of reasons. DC had heavily interfered throughout the run, changing and omitting things often due to conflicts amongst the staff. Certain characters and storylines were off limits, and Dwayne essentially had to work with what DC would give him. The result was an at times messy run with a few pacing issues and some unfinished plotlines. Many comic fans know how much this editorial interference really hindered the run, but there was still that one sector of fans. To them, the plot was messy because DC decided to focus on other things, more diverse things.
I came on to Justice League after a very successful run. And during that run, they had added 2 black members to the team. And it was already planned that 2 more black members would join the team very shortly. So when I came on the book, I was told right up front, bring the Black Green Lantern in, and bring in Firestorm, who's a kind of a young Spider-Man-ish superhero, who's a black college kid. And I'm like, oh, great, okay. And before I knew it, I had broken what I call the rule of 3. And that rule is, in popular entertainment, if there are 3 black people in it, it is a black product. You know, you can have 2 black guys, although it's a stretch. If you have 3, it's a black show. And suddenly it was a black show. And somebody, I think the artist did a pinup with all the black characters, and somebody leaked it and said, that's the cover. McDuffie's going to turn the Justice League all black. He's getting rid of the white guys, you know. Never a plan, never even considered, but it freaked people out, so they're reading this stuff looking for proof.
McDuffie made Vixen, a black woman, the field leader of the team during this run. That leadership decision drew fan backlash, with forums at the time calling it political correctness gone too far. McDuffie was so busy trying to make the league black that they sacrificed the story quality. Only this wasn't true. Despite its issues, the run still did well, and sales were extremely strong. Vixen received probably the most development as a character than she ever had before. It had decent performance both financially and critically. Again, the outrage was amplified, but the actual comics, they held up. They don't have the data to back up that general audiences are as fringe as they are, so they rely on applying their own outrage. If they're loud and obnoxious enough, then maybe they'll convince you that this is an opinion that everyone shares, despite streaming, box office numbers, sales, and reviews from casual and serious fans alike saying otherwise. Again, a big megaphone to compensate for a tiny voice. I mean, you talk to somebody in real life that's not on the internet about this and when the outrage alone doesn't stick, the fallback is always the same. We don't have a problem, we just care about the quality of real storytelling. It sounds noble, right? But here's the catch. Quote-unquote real storytelling is a throwaway term. These fans do talk about storytelling, but not in any genuine sense of the craft. They use the language of narrative analysis as kind of a gotcha weapon. Terms like character development, plot holes, or internal consistency get thrown around, but not to deepen the understanding of the work. Instead, it's about stripping context and ignoring subtext until they can frame something as a failure.
And what kills me about it is when they're writing about it, they're always hyper-rational. You know, look, the fact is there are more white characters, and if you picked randomly, you would end up with all white teams. And the fact that there are 3 black people on this team is statistically ridiculous. I mean, it's obviously a quota. And the quota arguments on fictional teams crack me up. Because who's actually, I'm sorry, somebody losing a job here? Which fictional character is losing a job? There's no connection. You know, they're not talking about what's going on in the comic books. They're talking about what they think is going on in their lives, and that's not really going on either.
They're more than willing to suspend disbelief and follow a story's internal logic when it suits their narrative. If the character or plot beat affirms what they already like, suddenly context and subtext matter again. Nuance is allowed, complexity is embraced. But if they perceive something as forced or woke, that generosity disappears. Suddenly the same tools they use to praise one story are flipped into weapons against another. When Dwayne wrote Vixen into JLA, he gave her one of the run's most layered arcs. Her powers malfunctioned and absorbed other team members' abilities, creating trust issues. She clashed with Black Canary over leadership and wrestled with whether or not she was chosen for her skills or as a diversity pick for optics. These threads made her one of the most complex characters in the run. Yet these same critics dismissed her with buzzwords and phrases such as poorly written, not JLA worthy, one-dimensional, or she doesn't belong. On the surface, these sound like valid critiques of the way she was written, but none actually engaged with her struggles with loyalty, identity, or moral responsibility, problems that were central to her story. Hardly any could elaborate on what made her written so poorly within the context of the story. Instead, these phrases work as rhetorical shields, masking bias under the guise of literary standards. Fans never demanded this level of justification from characters like Red Tornado or Plastic Man, who, despite sharing the stage, had much thinner and much less fleshed out arcs. Only Vixen had to clear that impossible bar, and it makes you wonder, was the real discomfort with his storytelling, or who was being written into the spotlight?
It kind of goes into the sort of the fundamental thing that we're getting out of the genre, which is our heroic image of ourselves. You know, it's very much a power fantasy, it's very much a male power fantasy, it's very much a white power fantasy. So if I write, as I have many times, a story where Daredevil, who doesn't have powers, gets the drop on Thor, who has unbelievable powers, people go, oh, that's so cool, Daredevil was so clever. If I have the Black Panther do the same thing, that's impossible. It's like, yeah, it's impossible with Daredevil too, man. It's like, I write Batman all the time in Justice League, where he's hanging out with 7 guys who by any logic should be able to, eat his lunch without even working up a sweat. And he's constantly outmaneuvering them and outfighting them and outthinking them, and we think Batman is so cool. But when black characters do much less relative to where their positions are, it makes the readership uncomfortable because they're not used to seeing it.
The end result is a lazy, bad faith way of consuming media. One that not only weaponizes storytelling language, but also hides personal bias behind the facade of quote-unquote objective critique. By tossing out terms like forced or one-dimensional without ever engaging in the actual text, you create the illusion of thoughtful analysis while sidestepping the real conversation. Why certain stories are denied the same suspension of disbelief and narrative generosity routinely granted to others. But at the end of the day, regardless of how long this anti-progressive argument has existed, or how it tries to present itself, one thing remains certain. It proves that Dwayne was right, that black and other marginalized stories would always be treated as intruders in superhero spaces, no matter how well they were written. Because the pushback wasn't about storytelling quality, it was about who was being given narrative importance. He knew that the second you give a black or minority character depth, agency, or narrative centrality, people would invent reasons why it quote-unquote doesn't work. He called it years before this current culture war garbage that we have today, the belief that diversity in media will always be read as political, while the endless recycling of white stories will always be read as neutral. That's why his work wasn't just about representation, but exposing the bias built into the very reception of these stories, on both an audience and corporate level. Audiences love Dwayne's work, even his most politically charged stories. They love the clever plotting, the fast-paced action, the layered character interactions, but the moment he struck a nerve, the moment a story forced them to confront perspectives or realities they hadn't been in agreement with, that love started to evaporate. The same readers who praised the intricacies suddenly claimed it was too political or overly agenda-driven. Complexity that fit their comfort zone and aligned with their politics was celebrated. Complexity that challenged their assumptions was weaponized against the story. On a corporate level, the pattern was eerily similar. Editors and executives embraced Dwayne when he delivered stories that filled their pocketbooks, whether it be sold-out books or viewership records on TV. It didn't matter how progressive his politics were, so long as he brought the dollars in. That is, until he challenged them directly. The minute Dwayne challenged DC themselves, whether it be in his work or in interviews, he too saw the consequences of what happens when you're too quote-unquote political. Remember that infamous Justice League of America run from earlier? Yeah, well, in May 2009, Lying in the Gutters, which was a comic book rumor forum, ran a compilation of 2 years worth of Dwayne's answers to fan questions on the DC Comics discussion boards. Throughout it, he details how stressed and frustrated he was with DC's editorial interference when working on the title. From comments about how certain storylines had to be scrapped and abandoned last minute to accommodate other writers, to him being unable to use certain characters for no reason other than them being unavailable. He even details how he responded to their interference. The Anansi storyline he wrote was about him not having control over the stories in his book. While the column itself no longer exists, multiple secondary sources quickly reported on the remarks, including DC's response. They fired him. Dwayne was fired from Justice League of America, citing that he quote-unquote revealed sensitive information regarding their creative process. Dwayne states, "It was my own doing. I was fired when Lying in the Gutters ran a compilation of 2 or so years of my answers to fans' questions on the DC Comics discussion boards. I'm told my removal had nothing to do with either the quality of my work or the level of sales, rather my revelation of behind-the-scenes creative decisions." Yep. That's right, creative decisions. Detailing about how your higher-ups gave you the runaround and essentially wasted your time and resources is revealing creative decisions. They had no problem with him being a poster boy. They had no problem with putting his name on the marquee when Static Shock and Justice League Unlimited was doing so well. They had no problem with letting him be the guy they pointed to whenever they needed to show off how progressive they were willing to be. But the second he pulled back the curtain, the second he spoke honestly about what it meant to work within the machine, the compromises, the arbitrary restrictions, the systemic barriers to telling the kinds of stories he believed in, suddenly he was disposable. And the irony here is that his fight firing didn't happen because the stories weren't selling, or because fans weren't responding well, or even because his peers disliked working with him. By his own account, the sales were fine, the work was strong. The problem wasn't the art. The problem was the honesty. The problem was that Dwayne said the quiet part out loud. Corporate tolerance works exactly like some of these fans' tolerance. It's conditional. They'll let you be progressive so long as that progressiveness either doesn't hit too close to home or flies under the radar. They'll let you write about systemic issues so long as it doesn't point back to them. They'll let you tell the truth so long as it never becomes their truth. The minute it does, you've crossed that invisible line, and suddenly you're too political. But here's the thing, when Dwayne spoke out, it wasn't because he couldn't take criticism or was being petty, it was because he knew exactly what was being lost. Every time an editor softened a character, cut an arc short, or killed a story that pushed too far, they weren't just interfering with his work. They were setting precedent and erasing the possibility of stories that mattered. Dwayne understood that interference is never neutral. It always protects what's safe, what's comfortable, what's already been done. And when you're a black creator pushing for authenticity, every note, every suggestion, every maybe not this time, is just another way of saying you can exist here, but only on our terms. Decades later, those same structures still stand. Studios, networks, corporations, they'll greenlight black stories, but only if they don't rock the boat too hard. They'll put a black creator in charge, but only if they don't lead too far. And if you do dare go that far, you'd better bring in the profits to justify it. Dwayne knew all of that. He knew comfort is a cage, which is why he fought so hard to demand better. As much as Dwayne McDuffie fought, as loudly as he called things out, as much as he stood his ground, he never got the chance to see just how much the world would prove him right. On February 21st, 2011, Dwayne McDuffie passed away suddenly from complications after emergency heart surgery. The industry lost one of its sharpest voices, and black comics lost a leader who had only just begun to scratch the surface of what he was capable of. He didn't live to see the streaming boom, the superhero takeover of Hollywood, the so-called diversity wave, the Gamergate nonsense, and the ensuing culture war bullshit that followed. He didn't get to watch the same studios that once sidelined him for being too progressive scramble to prove how progressive they were. And that's where his story leaves us with the question, what now? Because Dwayne's death wasn't just an end to a career, it was the beginning of a void that every black creator still feels when they're trying to push past the limits of what the industry says is acceptable. His legacy isn't just about the stories he told, but about the fight he picked, which means the real challenge isn't in remembering Dwayne McDuffie alone, but carrying that fight forward that he started. Well, how? How do we continue to support creators who, like Dwayne, refuse to settle for what's comfortable? And most importantly, when is that fight actually over?
What are you supposed to do when you have the weight of the world on your shoulders?
Plant your feet.
14 years ago, the entertainment industry not only lost one of its boldest comic book writers, but a screenwriter who refused to water down his vision for anyone's comfort. He believed stories weren't just meant to entertain, but to challenge us, to inspire us to take action in the real world. And with his passing, the question of legacy becomes unavoidable. What happens to a movement when its loudest voice is suddenly gone? Well, someone else steps in. Someone else has to carry that torch, because everything he and his peers built wasn't just groundbreaking, it was a blueprint. Like we said earlier, everything Dwayne did not only created a roadmap for how to tell black stories, but how to do so without compromise. And that torch is carried in different ways. A decent chunk of this video has been about Milestone Media and how they managed to accomplish so much before going defunct in 2008. Well, what if someone carried on that torch as well? What if writers saw the blueprint that was laid out by them and built on top of it? Well, that's exactly what happened. In 2020, Reginald Hudlin, along with original co-creators Dennis Cowan and Derek Dingle, revived the company with Milestone Returns. It takes the same characters from the original Milestone run, only reimagines them in the modern day instead of the 90s. The characters were already loosely assimilated into the mainstream DC multiverse, however, they now have their own designated universe. Earth M. At their core, the stories that took place in the original Dakotaverse were never just about capes and powers, they were about survival, resistance, and the lived realities of being black in America. Static wasn't just another black kid with electricity powers, he was a teenager navigating gang violence, police profiling, and the weight of systemic neglect. Icon and Rocket weren't just black Superman and his sidekick, they were a direct challenge to respectability politics and the idea of what a black hero should even look like. Crazy part is, those themes haven't aged out. The same conversation Milestone was having in the 90s, mass incarceration, systemic inequality, economic exploitation, those exact same conversations are happening today. If anything, they've only become more pronounced and amplified in black media. One, due to social media, and two, black audiences are far less willing to accept watered down versions of the truth. Let's start with Static Shadows of Dakota by Nicholas Draper Ivey and Vita Ayala. They could have easily just retold the same story from the original run, you know? Look guys, it's Static, but now he has an iPhone. No, instead they took the original core themes that define the characters and sharpened them. The struggle of being a teenager dealing with superpowers is still there, but it's now layered with a harsher, more modern look at the violence and systemic neglect that shaped Dakota. It explores just how easily those same destructive forces can consume you if you don't have a strong support system in the form of a community. The same can be said with Hardware versus Icon. The writers use time travel as a plot device to explore the nature of social progress, specifically asking how slow or rapid is it supposed to be. We can see Icon's slow, methodical approach to issues clash with Hardware's steadfast, direct way of fighting systemic issues. Again, same themes, but new compelling stories. Rocket, Zombie, Blood Syndicate, Shadow Cabinet, they're all back. They just wrapped up year 4 of a multi-season storyline that's been running since the pandemic. And when you actually read them, you see that the spirit of Milestone never left. However, there is one big problem. One with the audiences that goes unaddressed every single time we have this conversation. That being, you guys can be some pretty big hypocrites.
I'm like, what do you say fuck me for?
There's a common trend where comic book fans of underutilized characters will beg and complain about their favorite characters not being utilized, and then literally proceed to not buy the book when the publisher finally gives them a shot, not realizing they just defeated the whole purpose of their complaint and shot everyone in the foot. One step forward, 2 steps back. And we have examples of this. Remember we discussed Vixen? Y'all did the exact same thing when y'all complained about her being underutilized, but then later let her solo Rebirth series flop, despite it being well written and avoiding the issues we discussed. We let the same thing happen with Cyborg, Blade, Black Lightning. The hype was loud on social media, but when the actual issues hit the shelves, the sales didn't match the noise. And that's the reality. Publishers look at those numbers. If you don't support the book, it tells them the audience doesn't exist, and the cycle repeats. And I feel like a big reason why this happens is we keep forgetting that superhero fans are not the same as comic book fans. You have people out here that are huge MCU fans and will have seen every movie and show, but have never picked up a comic book. They're essentially isolated from the source material and only expose themselves to these stories when they're in an adaptation. And look, that's fine if film and TV is your preferred medium, but it stops being an excuse when you're the same people crying about these characters being quote-unquote wasted in comics while refusing to support the exact books that keep them alive. When a lot of people say we want more Static, let's be real, most of y'all are just talking about Static Shock, which honestly makes the excuse of not supporting these new comics even worse because those stories already borrow so much from the show. Ebon, he wasn't even in the original comics, he was made for the cartoon, but he got so popular they gave him the Harley Quinn treatment and pulled him straight into the Dakotaverse. I know people are typically against that synergy between comics and the screen, but this is one of those cases where it actually works. When you hop online and run off with claims like we want a Static movie or an Icon movie, but then don't support their current stories, it gets us nowhere. If Warner Brothers doesn't see enough dollars being generated from the comics and the material that already exists, what makes you think they're gonna give him another show or movie? Nostalgia can only get you so far. You have to support the current material. Go buy the books. Hell, you can't even use the excuse of not having a local comic shop anymore. Most comics have had digital releases for the past decade. The stories are back and more accessible than ever before, giving you exactly what you've been looking for. Why wouldn't you want to go support them? And that support has to leave the page and onto the screen as well. The way Dwayne wrote black characters was not limited to just superheroes, but all formats and visual mediums within entertainment. As critical as I am of Hollywood and the studio system, it'd be foolish to pretend that it's completely impossible for creators within said system to tell authentic black stories. After all, some of our favorite works, 8 or 9 times out of 10, are made by creators navigating said system. There's countless black creators out there, both independent and within the industry, literally begging you to support their work. And here's the thing, they're not just sitting around pointing out the flaws we all complain about, the endless parade of flat, performative, two-dimensional characters. They're taking steps to fix it. They're fleshing out black characters and reimagining what they can be, and this extends far beyond superheroes. It's film, television, gaming, animation, every medium where stories get told. The same themes Milestone was wrestling with 30 years ago, systemic racism, cultural erasure, exploitation, survival, are being wrestled with again today, just in new forms and new voices. The question isn't whether these creators exist, they do. The question is whether you're willing to support them before the corporations swoop in and tokenize the characters and sanitize the message for you. That's what all of this goes back to at the end of the day. Continuing to pave the way for underrepresented storytellers that don't fit a safe, comfortable mold. Whether they be black, Latino, Asian, queer, disabled, any identity. That's what Milestone stood for. It's what Dwayne McDuffie stood for. And hopefully that same ethos inspires you as a creator to do the same with your own story. So no, the fight never is truly over, no matter how easier or accessible it may be to see these types of stories. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether it's on the page or on the screen. There will always be those in both the audience and the boardroom that'll push back at their discomfort. But as long as that story has a mouth or a pen willing to tell it, it will never die. That was Dwayne McDuffie's greatest gift, showing us that our stories don't need permission to exist, and if those stories are deemed too black, then so be it, because that's exactly why they need to be told.
You know, everybody loves you now. Your obit got a quarter page in the Times, more in the LA Times. They even ran something about your passing in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. No joke, I googled it. Sugar and Spike? Little Lulu? My point is, everyone loves you now because you're no longer a threat. Folks who ignored and belittled your work in life are anointing you in death.
It's like Dr. King.
I was going for Philip K. Dick, but the same principle applies. Just when the fans figured out you were deep, too. I mean, the giant subway token in John Tower's trophy room? Too subtle? Wow.
Worst of all, people who despised you get to tell your story. They will add and subtract to suit their own purposes. Nothing we can do about that.
That's just what happens to legends. You're one of us now.
Yeah. Welcome to Dakota.